I'm going to be talking about some general concepts and how we think about anger, and then I'm going to be talking specifically about some strategies for how to work on discharging anger, how to heal anger in sessions. So I think anger in many ways has gotten a bad rap because people who behave really destructively use their anger a lot as an excuse for what they're doing. Like, oh, I did that act of violence, or I did that act of destructiveness or selfishness, called you a horrible name, whatever, ruined that event because I was so angry. And it's not because they were so angry that they did those destructive things. There's a bunch of other factors that went into someone's choice to behave destructively. And it involves things like their attitudes, their sense of entitlement, their sense of superiority. It involves whether they give themselves permission to behave in those kinds of ways when they're angry. Sometimes it is related to some very deep wounds, but it still doesn't come down to like, oh, it's because I was so angry. And unfortunately, we then come to have this kind of negative view of anger because of those things that we hear when it's being used as an excuse. So anger is a legitimate and important emotion like any of the other emotions we have, and has a very important warning role to play, as all of our painful emotions do. And I've talked about this elsewhere, but I'll just review here that anger is present to warn us to the presence of injustice. That's why we have anger. It's to tell us that something's going on that's not fair or that's wrong. So it's really an important presence inside of us. Like any other painful emotion, if it stays around too long, it can start to not be good for us. It can start to eat us up inside. So if you're trying to figure out, oh, well, am I too angry or is my anger a problem? The question is, how is it affecting you? Is it starting to eat you up inside? Is it corrosive? Well, then, yeah, it would be really important to get it out of there and heal. But anger also is a motivator. It's an energizer. For people battling oppression, it gives them tremendous energy to fight back against that oppression. That sense of anger and outrage is very powerful. That's why dominant groups, oppressive groups, are very eager to take your anger away if you're in a targeted group. And we see, for example, with male-female dynamics, men being very eager to stomp women's anger out. Don't you dare be angry. That's unladylike to be angry. If you dare express anger, men who are into male power are often going to try to shove your anger quickly back down your throat to make you pay for having been angry. Why? Well, again, they're going to have all kinds of excuses for it, but the real reason is there's power in your anger, and they know there's power in your anger. And that's why they're so eager to take it away from you. And we see the same dynamics, unfortunately, between white folks who are trying to maintain white power and people of color, where there's just all this negative talking about, oh, black people are too angry, or this group is too angry, or that group is too angry, or, well, yeah, it's fine that you raised that issue, but you should have raised it, much more nicely or something. And it's the same thing. It's the reason the anger is perceived as so threatening is precisely because it has tremendous power towards liberation. So I want to clarify all that so you know that when I talk about healing anger, it's not because I think anger is inherently a problem any more than sadness is inherently a problem or fear is inherently a problem. None of those emotions are inherently a problem. They're a problem when they linger too long inside us. They're a problem when they start to eat us up inside. They're not the cause of bad behavior. They can be the excuse for bad behavior, but they're not the cause. So when I talk about the healing of anger, I'm talking about getting rid of anger that's eating us up. And a lot of our anger, particularly anger that we're carrying from long ago, is eating us up inside. It's corrosive. It's in the way. There's a whole other reason to work on anger in sessions, which is that working on anger also tends often to tap in to sensations of power, of powerfulness as opposed to powerlessness. And so when you manage to really work on some anger and discharge some anger, then there are often other feelings that come in behind it that you're also going to manage to work on and release. Particularly, I've noticed that grief often follows behind. When someone manages to get a bunch of anger out, then suddenly they're also getting a bunch of grief out. A big cry often follows a big bunch of angry storming. And I find this particularly in women. I think that women a lot of times, just all this anger that they've had to stuff away because the society requires that of women, all this anger that they've had to stuff away is also interfering with their ability to heal grief. One thing I notice about crying, about crying, is that women, in my experience, cry quite a bit more easily than men do, but they don't seem to have hard, deep cries much more than men do. The hard, deep, like cry your guts out, cry like a 2-year-old, just blowing it all out. In other words, the kind of crying that we find really healing, the kind of crying that's really cathartic, which is when you're just sobbing your guts out for a long time, 15, 20 minutes, 45 minutes, just, crying like it's the last thing in the world, like the dam broke. Women don't have a lot more access to that than men do. So even though that sort of lighter, weepier crying women do have a lot more access to, it's not super helpful. It's somewhat helpful compared to just totally stuffing it off. But it's not super helpful because what we most need to really heal is those gut-wrenching kind of cries. So I find that when people get a chance to be really angry, and particularly when women get a chance to be really angry, a much deeper, one of those nice cathartic, like, ooh, that felt so good kind of cries often follow behind. But other stuff can come out that the anger sets free. And some people conclude from that, and I think this is a mistake, some people conclude from that somehow anger isn't the genuine emotion, that anger is really just a cover for grief, or anger is really just a cover for fear or for something else. Because after you had this big storming session, suddenly you're crying or suddenly you're having a big laughing fit. That's not because it was somehow a cover for that. It's because in the processing of anger, you also let loose some of your power, and we have an easier time going into deep crying or into deep laughing when we're at the beginning feeling powerful, when we start from a place of feeling powerful. So it's because it sets that stuff loose, not because those are like the real feelings in any sense, because that's not the case. These are all real feelings, and these are all real wounds. Injustice is such a real wound. It's deeply wounding to the human being. We hate unfairness. We hate injustice. That's our nature. And so the anger that we're carrying about those things is very real, significant, powerful wounds that we carry inside of us. So I'm going to talk some about how to work on anger in sessions. And this is going to be speaking both to the counselor and to the client about what you can do to help the anger really move. So, speaking to the counselor, encourage your client to sit up straight, in other words, to take a kind of powerful position, or even to stand up. And when someone needs to work on anger, I often will encourage the person to literally stand. If you're co-counseling in person, stand with them, hold one of their hands, and you as the counselor too, adopt a strong stance. That's going to help your client adopt a strong stance. So standing tall, feet a little bit, not crazy wide apart, but a little wide apart, and gives you that kind of more sense of solid stance. And try to think about, like, let's imagine that someone was about to run into me. What kind of stance would I want to be in to make it as hard as possible for them to knock me over? That's how we want to be. Sitting or standing, though, either way, you're going to want to make sure your head is up, make sure your shoulders are back, that you're taking a kind of powerful position. Next, you're going to want to encourage the client to get loud, to really speak with a lot of volume. And this is a challenge. I find that people tend to be reluctant in a co-counseling session to get loud. And you ask the person, is there anyone around that can hear? No, there's no one around that can hear. Well, come on now, then let's do it. Let's get loud. I'm not sure really what the barriers are there. I think it's just old shame and embarrassment that we carry for the most part that makes it so hard to get loud. If your client's a woman, she's also going to be carrying some of those messages that this just isn't proper behavior. I'm not saying she agrees with those messages, but I'm saying she tends to be carrying those buried in there. So a lot of encouragement from the counselor is going to be helpful. Come on, louder, louder. if she's trying a phrase, if she's saying a particular thing, when she's done, say, okay, same thing, but louder this time. Come on, come on, come on. Loud, really loud. Yell it out there. Yell it out there full force. It's not about screaming. When I say full force, I don't really mean full volume. There's an interesting quirk in how anger tends to work. This isn't true for everybody, but for most people, that if you go out to screaming, out to like really literally yelling as loudly as you can, that can easily trigger feelings of powerlessness, which is odd because getting louder tends to make you feel more powerful, but only to a certain point. And when you get out to full-on yelling, I think it triggers early experiences that we had of times when we were truly powerless and we were screaming as loud as we could and nobody was responding, or people were responding badly. So if you're the client, do try to get louder and louder. If you're the counselor, do encourage the person louder and louder and louder. But generally, I don't encourage full-on screaming. It's worth a try, but just watch very carefully. If you're the client, watch very carefully to see if you're actually starting to feel less powerful rather than more powerful. If you're concerned about people hearing, yell into a pillow. Pillows are really effective because that you can yell so loud into a pillow and you're going to think, oh, they're still going to be able to hear me, and they can't. Like 10 feet away, 5 feet away, someone yelling into a pillow, you just barely hear it, and it certainly doesn't sound loud. At the same time, it tends to be quite satisfying for the client because in their own ears, it continues to sound really loud. That's why they're concerned that the pillow's not working. So you got neighbors or you got people in the house, in your dwelling, wherever it is, then if you need to yell into a pillow, go right ahead. Don't use a pillow if you don't need to, if there's no one around to hear, because it's really important to get your arms and legs into things. You want to be like swinging your arms in the air, or it's really great if you can literally be pounding an armchair or a couch, something, or a mattress in a bed, some firm but reasonably soft surface, so you're not going to get hurt. Pound, 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 and stomp your feet. It's really good to stomp on a cushion, just so you don't hurt yourself from stomping a hard floor, and maybe again you got other people in your dwelling that you're afraid you're going to disturb. Stomp on cushions, but get into it. Like other forms of deep discharge, it's true for anger that our great models are very young kids. A 2-year-old, 1-year-old, a 2-year-old, a 3-year-old. They're going to show you how to discharge anger, right? We call it a tantrum. What is proper anger discharge, angry storming, is what's referred to as a tantrum. And I've talked about tantrums at other times. Actually, I'll just say quickly, tantrums get treated as bad behavior, and they're not. They can include bad behavior, and when they include bad behavior, then the responsible adult has to stop the bad behavior, but they don't need to stop the tantrum. Going like this and pounding your feet and yelling, that's healthy discharge. That's not bad. What's bad behavior about that? If they're yelling things that are inappropriate, then you have to tell them you can't say that. If they're calling vulgar names or making unfair accusations or saying that you're terrible, but a kid who's furious about something that they feel was wrong, or that they think is unfair, or they're furious that they're being asked something to eat that they don't want to eat, the tantrum in itself is not bad behavior. If they're throwing food, that's not okay. If they're throwing their spoons, that's not okay. But it's very important for adult caretakers to distinguish between the bad behavior and the tantrum. And unfortunately, that's not what happens. Unfortunately, the tantrum itself gets treated as bad behavior. Same thing happens with kids about crying, where the crying itself gets treated as bad behavior, where adults will start to say, well, you're not going to get anything by being that way, when the only that way that the child is being is that the child is crying. The child is in deep grief and is attempting to discharge it. So we want to try to get as close as we can to how the 2 or 3-year-old does this. They'll show us how to cry. They'll show us how to laugh. They'll show us how to tremble when they're scared. They'll show us how to storm out our anger and outrage. So we're going for that tantrum. That's what you're going for. Kicking the feet, pounding the arms, like this with your head. That's what's going to get the anger out. Try to simplify what you're saying. And if you're the counselor, encourage the client to keep it down to a few words. You don't give a whole speech. Like the client is often going to be blasting it out at someone who's not literally there, right? They're going to be talking to someone from their life or some group from their life as if those people were in the room. Try to get them to simplify what they're saying. It's like back to the exercise we did about offering the client a phrase, right? Where a whole stream of words doesn't actually tend to help us get the feelings out. A smaller number of words, some words do tend to help compared to just not using words. Although I'll come back to say another thing about that in a moment, where sometimes no words is good too. But to try to keep it to a sentence or two sentences or even a short phrase, and try to get the client to say it over and over and over again with force, and just keep getting back into the emotion, back into the emotion, back into the emotion. Because trying to work on this stuff is closely related to times when we were powerless or were made to feel very powerless, and because of all the societal prohibitions on anger discharge, particularly in women, but also in men, it's easy for the client to slip off into feeling isolated without necessarily even realizing that they have slipped off into feeling isolated. So if you're the counselor, try to catch your client's eye from time to time. Not constantly, but every minute or two. Hi, I'm still here. I'm with you. You're doing great. Keep going. I'm right behind you. Just a quick glance. You never want to pressure your client to maintain eye contact with you. That's not going to help them at all. It's actually going to distract them from their feelings. I'm just saying quick eye contact, like, hi, I'm still here. I'm with you. And that way you just help to make sure that your client isn't sliding off to feeling like they're fighting a lonely battle against the world. You're just helping remind them, no, you are accompanied, you have an ally, we're fighting this fight together. That's really important. If you're in the client role, don't hesitate to ask for additional support or reassurance that you need. I feel like I'm just being so nasty, or I feel like I'm being so vulgar, or God, you're going to think I'm such a bad person. So ask for those kinds of reassurance, and that gives your counselor a chance to say, oh no, this is great. This is exactly what you should be doing. Your anger is beautiful. It's great to see this stuff blasting out. So when you're in the counseling role, you don't have to wait for your client to ask for reassurance. You can periodically say, oh, this is so great, or you have no idea how. It's not exactly that your anger is beautiful, but you have no idea how beautiful your power is. And your outrage is so justified, and I'm right behind you, and there's nothing ugly about this at all. Because that's one of the messages we get, right, is that blasting out our anger is ugly. And it's like, no, you're not being ugly. This is beautiful. Go, go, go. I'm right behind you. People are often going to need to be vulgar, and they're going to need some reassurance that's totally fine. That you'll hear your clients sometimes maybe start to apologize about the language they're using, and you want to encourage them, please don't censor yourself. It's not going to help you when you're trying to work your anger out. And like, I've heard it all before. We've all heard it a million times before. So yeah, please don't edit your words. If you've got to just drop 1,000 F-bombs during your session, just do it. Go, 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 go. And as uncensored as possible is going to really help the client out. As I was referring to earlier, it's going to work sometimes really well to not use any words. It's worth a try. So I will sometimes, if I'm in a counseling role, I'll have the client try just going like, ah, ah, ah. And sometimes, they need to quickly go back to the words, but sometimes not. Sometimes it almost feels good to be liberated from the words and not feel like they have to explain to these imaginary people or whatever anything. It's just like, it's like, yeah, I mean, maybe it's not that different from the FU kind of thing, but it puts you into this kind of like total power, like growl, gorilla kind of place. And it also allows you to just totally focus on the extent of your outrage and not feel like you're thinking about how to put it into words. Now, I also made reference to how the anger discharge is often going to set other emotions free. So I'm now speaking primarily to the client. Let it go wherever it goes. And you might think, oh, today I really needed to work on my anger. Well, it'll be there to work on another day. If you suddenly are into a flood of grief, or you're suddenly into a flood of giggles and laughter about stuff, that discharge is just as important. And I think it works better to just let it go where it goes. I always talk about how our distress, our wounds, our pain is just layered inside of us. And when you peel off a layer, you don't know what you're going to find underneath it. And it's best to just go with what you find there and peel that layer off, and then you'll see what you find under that layer, and just go with that and peel that off. It's better generally not to try to take control of the process. If at the end of the session you feel like, yeah, but I really also needed to get my anger out, come back to it again in your next session. It'll be there for you. There's no hurry, and there will be maybe the very next time will be the time when you just pretty much stay in the anger the whole time, and you're discharging that and you're working on that. So don't fight it too hard. Make sure you're letting it go. Come back periodically in the session. This is something the counselor can be a real help with, to paying attention to being proud. Being proud of your outrage, being proud of your clarity, that you saw what was wrong when it was so wrong, whether it was a wrong to you or a wrong to somebody else. We want to take pride in our ability to recognize injustice, take pride in the fact that you're now yelling out, calling it for how wrong it was. Be proud of the ways you fought back. Try to be proud even of ways that you fought back that were not ideal. Often when we look back on ways that we have fought back against wrongs at other points in our lives, we think, yeah, but that was, I would have been so much better if I'd done it this way, or geez, I fought back, but I fought back in kind of a nasty way. I could have fought back in a kinder way. And okay, yeah, we're always going to work on doing better. We're always going to work on having cleaner and cleaner ways that we stand up for ourselves, and cleaner ways that we stand up for other people that we care about. But we're not going to get it perfect. And it's much more important to fight for ourselves, whether we can get it perfect or not, than to not do it. It's much better to fight for the people that we love, even if we do it in some messy ways or some not such kind ways, than to not fight for the people we love. So yes, keep trying to get it better. We're all trying to keep doing it in cleaner, less attacking, less violent ways, to learn to be that kind of people who can just firmly stand up for themselves in a way that does not put the other person down, just says, no, you can't do that. That's great. We're all going to reach for that. But don't let that standard keep you from fighting for yourself. In other words, don't feel like, well, but I can't stand up for myself because I might do it in a messy way. It's like, much better to stand up for yourself in a messy, maybe somewhat unkind way, than to not stand up for yourself. And so then when we're looking to experiences from the past, we want to take an outlook even about things that we didn't necessarily do so well. Or maybe we fought back in some ways that ended up being not good for us. Maybe we ended up fighting back in some ways that ended up being self-destructive. We still want to take pride in that impulse. We still want to take pride in the fact that we tried. And yeah, I made an effort. I was trying to stand up for myself, or I was trying to stand up for people I loved, or I was trying to stand up for pets, for animals that I care about. We all have histories of all these things. And we want to work to be proud of those efforts, whether they were done in great ways or whether they were done in not such great ways. The impulse is still so right, and particularly in our experiences as children, or even our experiences as adults when we're battling against really powerful people or systems of oppression. It's not fair to expect of ourselves somehow that we should have been able to do it perfectly. We're rarely going to be able to do it perfectly. We'll do better as the years go by, but we're rarely going to be able to do it perfectly. If you're doing this work by yourself, like you're just around the house and you realize like I've got to get discharged some anger, just like sometimes you're going to end up just having a cry by yourself or a laughing fit by yourself, try to fill in a little bit for the fact that you don't have a counselor there. So you can even say out loud to yourself things like keep going, don't give up, fight hard, all the things that, sure, it would be better if you could have a counselor there to say those things, but you don't at that moment, that day, to try to really say that for yourself. And then, as always, when we're doing deep emotional work, make sure you leave enough time at the session to fully get the client's attention out. And we may think of anger stuff as less heavy. It isn't automatically less heavy. A lot of times the things that we're most angry about are really heavy things that happen to us, or really heavy things that happen to people that we cared about. It can be as intense as going to really deep grief or really deep fear. So don't rush the present time part of the session. If you're in the counseling role, make sure that you're asking enough of the looking forward tos and the fun questions, and then check with the person. How are you doing? Is this a good place to end, or do you need a couple more questions to be back to being fully present? So, last thing I'm going to say is that not everyone needs to work on anger. There are often phases in life where that's not the issue for us. There are often people who really need to spend much more of their time on other things. And one thing that comes to mind particularly about this is that frustration is different from anger. And when you're feeling really frustrated, sometimes that is really related to anger, to experiences where we really got squelched, or we couldn't be angry, or we were just left powerless. But not always. Sometimes frustration really is about other things. I was telling you, you can't assume that anger is about other things. You shouldn't even assume that frustration is about other things, but sometimes it is. Frustration is actually often frustration that comes from crying that we really needed to do that we weren't able to do. And I find this a lot in men in particular who are feeling very frustrated. They don't necessarily need sessions on anger. They often need sessions on grief. And that's actually what's going to relieve their frustration, because what they're so frustrated about is how desperately for years they've been craving a good cry that they're almost never getting to have. So that's something that the counselor should not have judgments about. That wouldn't be appropriate. That's something that as a client you need to explore for yourself. To think like, oh, if I'm getting into all this frustration, is this about anger? Is this about injustice, or am I really frustrated about something else? Just take a look at it. Sometimes you'll decide, no, this really is about anger, and other times you'll think like, I probably really need a session right now that's much more oriented towards grief, or much more oriented towards embarrassment and anxiety, the kinds of things that we laugh out, that we discharge through laughter, and a bunch of yelling and pounding right now isn't actually going to really get at what I'm needing right now. So make sure that you attend to having a session from time to time. Now I'm talking to everybody as a client. Make sure that you attend to having a session from time to time where you really work on anger, unless you're positive, unless you feel very sure that that's not where you need to be going right now. Not all the time, but just once in a while. Make sure you're doing this. And just like I've asked the client, the counselor to push the client, I want you to push yourself some, to get physical, get your body into it, try to overcome the embarrassment about pounding your arms and stomping your feet and making big facial expressions. Try to overcome your embarrassment about vulgar language, and try to overcome your embarrassment about volume. Go out there and get loud. Discharging anger is such a relief sometimes. And I've actually just had a couple of experiences recently of working with people on anger, whether in classes I was co-counseling classes I was teaching or outside of those classes, where the person afterwards was saying, "Wow, like, oh my God, that just felt so good to get that stuff out."